We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Tes Amud Beis in Mesechet Nedarim. This is Nedarim Daf 19b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara said that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who holds that Safek Naziris is lahakal, that by a Safek Naziris situation, we are going to be lenient. The case on the previous Amud of Rabbi Yehuda was, let's say a person says he's going to be a Nazir if it turns out there's 100 core in that Kri, in that particular heap, and then we have a Safek because we can't find the heap. Either it was stolen or it was lost. So in that situation, Rabbi Yehuda says that we are lenient. And the Gemara asks on this from our Mishnah, because Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah seems to say that by a Safek Neder situation, we would be strict. As the Gemara here says, Hamakir and Asurin, let's say we knew that the Anshe Galil were familiar not only with regular Trumas HaGoren, but also with Trumas HaLishka, so it's a genuine Safek when the person made a Neder. Were they saying this should be like the Trumas HaGoren, or were they saying this should be like the Trumas HaLishka? And it sounds like from the Mishnah, if we knew that the Anshe Galil recognized and were familiar with both kinds of Truma and it was a Safek, we actually would be strict. Hamakir and Asurin, we would be strict and we would say it was a good Neder. We would say that they were referring to the Trumas HaLishka. So there it sounds like Rabbi Yehuda is strict in a situation of a Safek Neder. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rava says, Rava, Gabe Kri, when it comes to the heap, by the case of the Nazirus, Kasavar, so there Rabbi Yehuda holds, Kol Shesveiko Chomer Mivadai. In a situation of Nazirus, a Safek Nazirus, if we're going to be strict and say that the person is a Nazir out of Safek, that's actually even stricter than a Vadai Nazir. So there, Lo Ma'ayel Nafshe L'Sveika, there we don't assume that a person will bring himself into a scenario of doubt, and we assume that if the heap cannot be found, certainly the person did not intend himself to be a Nazir. And the Gemara explains why a Safek Nazir is more strict than a regular Nazir. The Ilu Gabe Nazir Vada, because when it comes to a person who's certainly a Nazir, so then Megaleach, Umevi Carbon Venechal, he can shave at the end of the term of the Nazirus, he could bring the appropriate carbon, the carbon can be eaten, you can complete that term of the Nazirus. But Al Sveiko, but if you have a situation where a person is a Nazir out of Safek, so Lo Matzi Megaleach, he can never shave because he'll never be able to bring the carbon because maybe it's not a real carbon. Maybe really he wasn't actually a Nazir. And the Mefarish over here explains, Kasavar lo ma'ayil inish. V'kevan desveiko chomer mivadai. Since when it comes to Nazirus, the doubtful Nazir is actually more strict than the person who's certainly a Nazir. So vadai lo ma'ayil nafshe ba'osa sveiko l'chumra. Certainly a person is not going to say, oh, I'm going to make a declaration of Nazirus, where in a situation of doubt, I'm also going to be a Nazir out of doubt, because that's already too strict. Rather, it's clear that when the person made the neder to be a Nazir, he was saying, if we can find the Kri and identify, if there's 100 core, then he'll be an appropriate regular Nazir. But certainly, if we can't find the Kri, he wasn't going to be a Nazir misveika l'chumra. A Nazir misveika l'chumra is a much more severe kind of Nazir. The Gabe Nazir misveika have a chumra yoser mivadai, because when it comes to a Nazir misveika, that's actually even more strict than a Nazir who is a Nazir vadai. And so that's why Nazir is going to be different in the case of the Kri by Nazirus. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to be different in that situation, and over there we're actually going to be lenient because no one is going to make themselves a Nazir in a Safek Machmir Nazir kind of situation. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Huna bar Yehuda l'Rava. So Rav Huna bar Yehuda said to Rava, Amar hareini Nazir olam. Well, what about in a case where a person would say, I'm a Nazir forever? So in that case, a Safek Nazir is no worse than a Vadai Nazir because the person's a Nazir forever regardless. So maybe in that situation, Rabbi Yehuda actually would say that the person is going to be a Nazir. What would be the halacha? Amar le, he said back to him, no, you're wrong. Nazir olam nami sveiko chamer mi vadai. Even if a person declares himself a Nazir forever, but a Safek Nazir forever is actually worse than a Vadai Nazir forever. And therefore it's the same situation. Rabbi Yehuda would be lenient over there as well. Nobody's going to want to be a Safek, a Nazir Olam, even in a Safek Chumra kind of situation. The Ilu Vadai, because whereas when it comes to a certain Nazir Olam, Hech Bitsaro Mekel Basar, the halach is if the person's hair becomes heavy, his hair grows out a lot, he can make it a little lighter using the razor, Umevi Shalosh Behemas, and he's at that point allowed to bring the 3 karbanos, and then he can continue his Nazirus after. V'ilu Sveiko Lo, but when it comes to a Nazir who's a Nazir of Safek, he doesn't have this leniency of Hich Bitsaro Mekel Basar, and so therefore again, a person is never going to bring himself into a Safek Nazirus situation out of a Chumrah, and therefore again we can assume to be lenient in that situation. But the Gemara continues, Amar Hareini Nazir Shimshon Mai. Well, what if the person says, I am a Nazir like Shimshon was a Nazir, and there we really would say certainly Even a vada, even a certain nazir in that case, it's not going to be more lenient than a suffix nazir. But the Gemara responds, Amar Lei said to him, Nazir Shimshon lo Tanya. The Nazir Shimshon is something that is never taught, meaning to say it was a one-time event that happened with Shimshon. He was a Nazir from the moment of his birth, but that would not be relevant in any practical situation. Amar Lei said back to him, Amar Avada bar Ava, but didn't Avada bar Ava say, Tanya Nazir Shimshon, that we did learn there are cases that are possible to replicate the situation of the Nazir Shimshon. So what do you mean it's not applicable? So Amar Lei, so he said back to him, Tanya, if it was taught, it was taught. Maybe indeed it is applicable. And the Mefarish over here explains, Amar Hareini Nazir Shimshon, if a person says, I am a Nazir Shimshon, Delo Megaleach Liolam, in that case the person doesn't shave at all. Klal at all. Michael Amema, what are you going to say in that case? Amai Kamer Rabbi Yehuda Mutter, why in that case would Rabbi Yehuda be lenient? Halekol Amemar, Desfeiko Chomer Mivadai, but when it comes to a Nazir Shimshon, the suffix Nazir is not more strict than the Vadai, because the Vadai is going to be a Nazir forever, and is never going to have the leniency of shaving. So Amar Lei said back to him, Lo Tanya, Lo Eshkechon Shum Braisa, the Katani Hareini Nazir Shimshon. We don't find such a Braisa that says that a person can pronounce themselves a Nazir Shimshon. The less a klal doesn't exist. V'chi Amar Hareini Nazir Shimshon, the Leichel and Naziris klal Mishum de Shimshon Lo Yatsa Naziris Mipiv. You can't say you're a Nazir Shimshon. Shimshon himself didn't pronounce himself a Nazir. He was a Nazir from the moment of birth. So therefore, again, this is a case that doesn't really apply, and that's how the Mefarish understands what it means that Lo Tanya, that Nazir Shimshon is not taught. The Ran has a slightly different interpretation. He says, Hareini Nazir Shimshon Mai de afilu Vadai lo motzi megalech besar. Again, Nazir Shimshon is strict. Even a Vadai Nazir Shimshon can never shave. Amar Le Lo Tanya. So the Ran learns, what does it mean Lo Tanya? To stama lo mashma Nazir Shimshon. When a person says Nazir, he doesn't mean to say Nazir Shimshon. That's not the case when a person is declaring himself a Nazir. The Gemara says, Vatanya Nazir Shimshon, according to the Ran, but there is a Brisa that has him pronouncing himself a Nazir Shimshon. The Ika Brisa, the Tane Behedya, the Rabbi Yehuda Matir, but Omer Hareini Nazir Shimshon. There's actually a Brisa that Rabbi Yehuda is lenient when a person says, I am a Nazir Shimshon, and Yesh Bekri Azem Me'akor V'halachum Etzosha Nignav. If he says, I'm a Nazir Shimshon, if there is in this heap 100 corn, and then he finds out that it's stolen, so actually Rabbi Yehuda is, in that case also is lenient, even though again a suffix Nazir Shimshon is not stricter than a Vadai. And to that the Gemara answered, Tanya. Well, if there's a brisa like that, fine. V'lo yadana lefruku. We will not be able to answer up that brisa. To lo tikshi ahid de'ein anshe galil makir trumas halishka to mashma makir asurn. We won't be able to answer up that contradiction because Rabbi Yehuda by the anshe galil implies that when it comes to suffix neder we are machmir. And in this particular case, if there is a brisa that talks about Hareini Nazir Shimshon by the case of the Mea Kur and the Kri, if Rabbi Yehuda said lenient in that case, it would be a contradiction within Rabbi Yehuda. Inami, or you can understand the Gemara Tanya or Trei Tanoy. I'll leave it to Rabbi Yehuda. If there's such a brisa, fine, and it would be a machlokas tanoim in terms of whether Rabbi Yehuda is lenient or whether he is strict. And the Gemara continues, Ravashi Yomer Ravashi says, Hahi Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Tarfani. That brisa where Rabbi Yehuda is lenient, that's actually Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfan. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Tarfan Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Tarfan, Ein Echad Mehem Nazir, none of them are considered a Nazir, Lefi Shelo Nitna Nazirus Ela Lahafla, because when it comes to Nazirus, the person has to spell out clearly that they're making themselves a Nazir, otherwise they are not a Nazir. And the Mefarish explains, Rav Ashi Yomar, he brisa decreed the matter Rabbi Yehuda besafik nazirus, Rabbi Yehuda mishum Rabbi Tarfani. That brisa by the heap where Rabbi Yehuda is lenient by safik nazirus, that's actually Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfan. He says, Ein echad mehem nazir. Let's say you have a case of shnayim sheyomdim v'yomar echad hareini nazirim zeh ish ploni sheba kenegdeinu. Let's say there are two people standing. One of them says, if that's so and so over there, then I'm a nazir. V'idach amar hareini nazir meinohu, and the other one says, I'm a nazir. If that's not him, so Rabbi Yehuda from Rabbi Tarfan says, Ein echad mehem nazir. Neither of them are nazir. Since at the moment of the neder it wasn't clear at that time, shelo nitna nazirus ela lahafla, because nazirus has to be something clear at the moment that you pronounce it. The bo'inan b'shas shenadar sheyodea he have a nazir at the time that he makes the neder, that he's a nazir, he has to know that he's going to become a nazir, and that same reasoning would apply according to Rabbi Tarfan. That same reasoning would apply by the Kri as well, since he doesn't know at the time of the pronouncement, at the time of the declaration, that he's going to become a nazir, so the person would not become a nazir, and that's why we would be lenient in such a case. But the Gemara continues, Ihachi, if so, Ma'irya shenignavo sha'avat. So why is it that in that case of the Nazirus by the Kri, that it says in that Braisa that the Kri was either stolen or lost, and we can't determine whether it had 100 kor or not, so it's a Safek Nazirus, even if we could determine the person wouldn't be a Nazir, because the Nazirus only happens in a situation where it was clear at the moment the person declared himself a Nazir that he was a Nazir. And so the Gemara answers to that, Ela lo hodiacha kochud Rabbi Shimon. The reason why the case of the Kri where it was stolen or lost, and we can't even determine if the person was a Nazir or not based on the condition, that's to tell us the strength of Rabbi Shimon's position. The afagav, the nignavo sha'avad, even though it was stolen or lost, and even though we really can't even determine if the condition was fulfilled, whether the person is a Nazir, kasavar ma'ayel inish nafshe l'sveika. Still, Rabbi Shimon is strict and says that a person is intending to make himself a Nazir even in that doubtful situation. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Rabbi Yehuda says, Stam Truma b'Yehuda v'chula. When it comes to Stam Truma and Yehuda, meaning when a person says this is like Truma in Yehuda, so then we assume it's talking about Trumas Halishka, and we are Machmir. But in Galil, where they don't recognize, they're not familiar with the Trumas Halishka, so there we assume they're talking about the Truma from the Goren, from the granary, and there we are going to be lenient. And the Gemara says, a similar inference we said before, Hamakir Nasurin. But again, if the people from Galil were familiar with both, then we would be strict. Almas Fekel L'chumra. You see that in a situation of a suffix by a neder, we're strict. Ema Seifa, but let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Stam Charamim b'Yehuda mutarin. It said that when a person says this is like Cherem, so in Yehuda we assume it's mutter. Uva Galil Asurin, but in Galil we say Asur, we're strict. Sheinan Shea Galil Makir Nes Cherme HaKohanim, because the people of Galil are not familiar with the Cherem of the Kohanim, so they're certainly talking about the Cherem of Shamayim, and therefore it's going to be Asur. And the Gemara says Hamakir and Mutar, but that implies that if they recognize both kind of Cherem, if they were familiar with both, then we would be lenient and we would say Mutar. Alma Sveika Lakula. You see from there that in a suffix situation we're lenient. So Amar Abaye, Abaye says, Sefer Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Tzaduki. The Sefer where it implies that we're lenient, that follows Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Tzaduk. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Stam Truma b'Yehuda Asura. Rabbi Yehuda says that if you have a case of Stam Truma in Yehuda, we say it's forbidden, we are strict. Rabbi Elazar Rebbe Tzaduk Omer, Rabbi Elazar Rebbe Tzaduk says, Stam Charamim b'Galil Asura. And when it comes to Stam Charamim in Galil, so then we say Asur, then we are strict. And so again, according to Rabbi Elazar Rebbe Tzaduk, he's the one that says that in Galil we are going to be strict. But in a situation where they'd be familiar with both, we would actually be lenient. He would say Sveika L'kula, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph.